everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic, hoping you well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the new Hayao Miyazaki film come in the #1 spot domestically, notching $12 million, and according to what we're finding over here at Deadline, it's actually somewhat of a record for a Miyazaki film in the United States. That all being said, these are all, of course, numbers not adjusted for inflation or other things like it, but the fact remains it is a very impressive opening weekend for an anime like this and its opening weekend. All the while, we've also seen Renaissance, a film by Beyonce, have have one of the worst drops that I've ever seen. For most movies, right? We're talking about, of course, films like The Marvels having a 79% or so drop from week 1 to week 2, and that was the worst in the MCU history. This film has dropped 77%. Can't really say I'm all that surprised because of just how poorly the film did in its opening weekend, but I will say it gives me some hope in humanity that people really aren't going out in droves to see this movie, and even though there is not an official production budget listed for this film, seeing that it probably costs somewhere around the ballpark of what the Taylor Swift movie cost, I would have to imagine. Again, that's just a complete guess on my part. This film will barely break even, if even that. And of course, we have to talk about the fact that they've probably made tons of money on their actual concert, right, on the original run of the concert that was being filmed. That all being said, it does make me happy to see a movie like that not succeed because it's just, again, I think a part of the sad state of our modern culture that Beyonce gets a movie and it somehow gets all this attention and all this hype and does nothing, all the while much better films are just kind of not getting the attention that I think that they honestly should. Before we go any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button. A lot of the fun, but honestly, smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So, of course, we'll also have an update for Godzilla -1, which had another strong weekend. Very good performance here domestically. Unfortunately, we did not get the 1-2 punch I was hoping for. I was thinking and hoping that we would get The Boy and the Heron, the new Miyazaki film, in the #1 spot, and then Godzilla -1 in the #2 spot. Unfortunately, the Hunger Games film is continuing to hold very strong. I was able to make about $1 million more this past weekend against Godzilla -1, and so therefore it will not be in that #1, #2 punch. That does not mean anything as far as how well Godzilla -1 is still doing, and it is still doing very well. If you have not seen it, please go out and see it. Actually, I put a review up also for The Boy and the Heron, and this film is also one that I think is worth seeing, especially if you are a fan of Miyazaki or other animes. I think that it kind of fits into his entire filmography very well. Definitely one of the more esoteric, one of the more kind of out there stories, but I do think that there's a lot of meanings in there, and it has the typical wit and charm that Miyazaki films have, where there's moments that you're just laughing, there's moments that you're kind of terrified because there's just some creepy stuff happening. I think that this image right here is already pretty creepy. With that being said, though, very, very impressive with this, and very impressed, right, I should say, with this, and so I recommend seeing this one. 2 Japanese films, right, really just dominating as far as just movie quality is concerned. All the while, there really isn't a whole lot of quality elsewhere. Going into the numbers at thenumbers.com, though, The Boy and the Heron, as I mentioned, got $12.8 million. Going into the weekend, the projections were around $10 million, right? I think that the range was somewhere in the 8 to 12 range, and so it did get towards the upper end of its actual release. Last night, something I did not mention in the review for The Boy and the Heron that I put out last night on the channel was that the IMAX screening I went to, it was one of these aquarium IMAX screens that sometimes shows regular films at very limited times. The theater was almost packed, and I have not been to a Saturday night film in quite a long time, let alone a film in an IMAX screen that actually it was completely packed for. So I was very impressed by those numbers. It did also make it a bit cramped, and we had 2 people in front of us that were leaning back very, very far for various reasons, health reasons, I should say. That should kind of give it away, which definitely made it a lot more uncomfortable to be seated in the theater itself. But even with that being very uncomfortable, the film was still very enjoyable. So I totally believe when I see 5,800 per screen, I buy it, right? I was in one of those screens that was completely packed. I'm sure there's also other screens across the country that are not nearly as packed, but I do think that the screenings for this film have been pretty well attended, at least especially for a G-Kids release for an anime film such as this. Hunger Games, as I mentioned, came in once again at the #2 spot. So even though Godzilla -1 had a very strong hold, 27% hold from last week, and that was after they added 232 screens, mind you. So they increased the theater size, and it still had a very strong hold. It was not enough, unfortunately, to edge out The Hunger Games, The Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes, which made $9.4 million, also having another strong hold 4 weeks out from its initial release. So even though Hunger Games did not have the best opening weekend, and really it did not move the needle all that much, kind of also proved the fact that actors don't sell movies anymore, which is why the entire excuse that the actor strike was somehow keeping people from seeing the film was just completely, redundant and ridiculous to boot. I do think that we are still looking at this movie as being impressive for what it is, as far as how much the film actually cost to make. Also, the fact that the film was financed in such a way where it didn't have to make nearly as much to make its money back. But also, just everything surrounding the movie, just again, kind of being that middle of the road film, is again impressive to say the least. That all being said, we have a lot more to break down with that movie, because even though it's impressive for what it is, it's still definitely nothing compared to, and a far shadow from what the other films in the franchise have actually done. And that's why I do think that one should be very cautiously optimistic if one is actually looking forward to any future Hunger Games movies based off of some of the characters or some of the stories that were introduced in this movie. Godzilla Minus One came in the number 3 spot, so still doing very well, still getting in that top 3. Was not able to edge out Hunger Games, even though we have seen Godzilla Minus One edge out Hunger Games in the daily numbers, right? As far as, several weekdays last week, for instance, Godzilla Minus One was able to edge that out for the number 1 spot in the daily numbers. But obviously, when it comes to the weekend, that is still going to be predominantly female audience showing up for the Hunger Games, just not showing up in any, similar fashion for Godzilla Minus One, which is sad because the film is great. But as we all know, box office does not always indicate quality. There's some really great films that never make any money. There's some really bad films that make tons of money. The fact is, though, it is a film I think well worth seeing. Trolls Band Together also held 21%, so a pretty decent hold there, percentage-wise at the very least. That film right now looks like it's tracking towards probably $100 million domestic by the end of its run. Definitely will be kind of pushing its way there, but I think it's definitely a possibility for that movie. All the while, a film that will never, ever see $100 million is the film Wish, which right now is at $49 million domestically after 3 weeks of release, and Disney has already pulled it from 490 screens, right? So typically Disney, when it comes to the first 2 weeks of their brand new films, they don't touch it, right? They leave it out in theaters, and theaters typically will have the deal. Disney will usually make the deal with them. You got to have our movie in your theater for 2 weeks. You have to have this showtime in 3D, etc. Right? They're still one of those companies that Disney is. That is one that really tries to tie the hands, as it were, of a lot of the people, in theater chains. Someone who worked at a theater for many years. I know that this is something that they're just very well known for doing, and it looks like that's probably still happening, especially when you look at just, again, the fact week 1 and week 2, you almost never see any difference in the theaters, and also just the general showings in typical theaters. Ever go to a theater, I would say pay attention to that, right? Look and see, okay, week 1, week 2, are there any real different showtimes in your Disney releases? And I think you'll find that they'll have the least movement as far as showtimes are concerned, even though they are not necessarily going to be the best performing, right? That's, again, one of the ways that they try to kind of control things behind the scenes. But with that being said, after week 3, you start to not have that nearly as much. They start to lose that grip. They start to lose that power a little bit. And 490 screens after 3 weeks of release. Keep in mind, right, in week 4, the Trolls Band Together has dropped 165, and that per theater ratio for Trolls is a lot better than what it is for Wish. Wish, as I said earlier in another video, this is just a catastrophe for Disney in so many different ways. It's the 100th anniversary film for them. This should have been one of the biggest releases in their history, and it's going to end up being one of the biggest flops in their history, especially in their animated history. Renaissance, a film by Beyonce, dropped 77%. And again, movie from AMC Theaters being distributed by them. $28 million domestically is where it's currently standing. That's pretty much where the vast majority of its money is coming from. And even though the budget for the film is probably quite low, and so it's probably going to make its money back technically, I'm just happy to see that it's not going to be any type of box office success. Again, sad for theaters to not get that money, but at the same time, those are really not the kinds of movies that I really want to be doing well at the box office. I would much rather Godzilla Minus One, The Boy and the Heron be the films that are actually doing well. I've not seen films like The Shift yet, but I've heard obviously a lot of good things about it. I've heard good things about also the film Thanksgiving as well. So those are the kinds of movies I would rather be seeing doing very well versus, the fare of Renaissance, Wish, and other films like it. Napoleon came in the number 7 spot, dropped 150 screens, so still dropping quite a bit for a film that cost as much as it did. Not going to be justifying its own existence based off of that. Waitress the Musical, it's a filmed version of the Broadway musical, so this is being distributed by Bleecker Street. So a decent number there for its opening. Can't really say much about it, though, because it's very limited in its release schedule, and those are films that are always very hard to track. Animal, a independent film, also, or I should say, I believe this is another one of these Bollywood releases. So this film also doing well for what it is. 622 screens, obviously, is just, again, a very small number. 3,600 per screen, though, so doing well, at least compared to its theater size. And then coming in the number 10 spot is Angel Studios' The Shift, dropping 50% in its second weekend. So definitely not a bad hold by any means, but also not a strong hold either. I'm wondering if this might be one of the one of the worst holds that they've had. I feel like a lot of their films, especially Sound of Freedom, was able to hold very, very well. I'm kind of also wondering if maybe we should do a comparison between this and After Death to see maybe a bit of a more accurate take about where this film might end up, and not just by the end of its run, but also just in comparison to those week 1 and 2 drop-offs. I just don't remember it being that drastic for that film. It very well could be, but still, The Shift is the movie I have on my radar. I hope to be able to see it sometime this week. But again, number one, right now it's in the number 10 spot. So the number 1 spot, as I said earlier, goes to The Boy and the Heron, the new film from Miyazaki, a very solid movie. Right now, it's at $86 million worldwide. This film did get its domestic release. It is already released in Japan. In fact, it released in Japan quite a while ago. It had a limited release July 14th in Japan. It then opened up wider to a limited release in South Korea on October 25th. And then it opened up in Spain, Turkey, France. So it's opened up to all these other markets. And so that's why it's been able to build up to $73 million. But still, $12.8 million from the American market, from the North American market, I should say, is still very, very good. Right now, there is no actual confirmed budget on this movie. The only thing we've been told is that it's the most expensive animated film to come out of Japan, I believe was the way that it was described. And up to this point, the most expensive Studio Ghibli movie was Princess Kaguya, I think is the name, is how you pronounce that one. And that one, I think, roughly estimated cost around $65 million American. So if that is indeed the case, that this film costs more, we could potentially see a cost of this movie being $65 million plus, which would be quite high, I think, for most animated films that come out of non-American countries. Usually when we hear about animated movies coming out of these countries, usually very low. And also usually when it's like an independent theater or an independent studio, I should say, even based in America or, mostly done in America, I feel like those also have usually low budgets. So it's interesting that this is a movie from Miyazaki that has somewhat of a more mainstream, big budgeted studio type box office. But we have to, of course, wait and see until that actually gets confirmed. That's just an estimate at this point in time. But still, film is doing pretty well for what it is at this point. Hunger Games, as I had mentioned, right now, $262 million worldwide. So it's looking like this film might track towards getting close to $300 million. So again, sounds like it's pretty much acting as what the numbers and the estimates seem to indicate after the first couple weeks of release. But it is important just to keep this in mind. And when it comes to this movie, it is still, as far as the franchise is concerned, a failure. All right. Again, we look at this movie and say it's making money. Obviously, making money is a good thing. But when you look at the amount of audience, right, the amount of people that you have lost in this franchise since the last movie back in 2015, it's quite staggering, right? So just to give a bit of a framework here, if you look at the domestic opening weekend of $44 million, right, the opening weekend for Mockingjay Part 2, which used to be the worst performing in the franchise, was over $100 million. Now, again, this is unadjusted for inflation. When you actually readjust it, it gets even wider, right? So it's 44 versus $128 million, right? The end result when you adjust is $807 million, right? Worst in the Hunger Games franchise. Now you're looking at a movie in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that's looking like it may top out at $300 million. So we're talking about a movie that did drastically less, like $500+ million less than what the predecessor did. So that is quite a staggering number there. And so again, even unadjusted, we're seeing it do about half of what the other markets have done, right? The number of international box office numbers there is about half of what the previous movie was. Even domestically, it's about almost half as well. So I do think that you have to, look at that, or at least when you look at it unadjusted, it's still about $100 million less than that. And it might end up being, getting closer to 150 domestic when the box office end eventually runs. I mean, obviously, I think it is going to have a decent hold over the holiday frame. It's going to stay in theaters. It's probably going to make a few million here or there. But I just think it's interesting. And also when you look at the numbers unadjusted in the daily performances, it only beat out the last Hunger Games film on the third Tuesday. And not even by all that much when you have the numbers unadjusted. So Again, that's the current state of the Hunger Games, and it's just not looking good at this point in time. What is looking pretty good, though, is Godzilla -1. Again, I wish these numbers were a bit higher because I think the film deserves it. I know there are some out there, some salty brethren out there, that think the film is overrated, and I would just disagree. I would think that the film is actually very good. I think that the movie is one of the best films of this year. You could say that that's not saying all that much, but regardless of that, it is still a objectively good movie. I think that most of us are able to at least admit that point, and it is infinitely better than anything in the Monsterverse. And yes, I'm sure I just triggered a bunch of people who are Monsterverse people, but I do think we could at least agree that this is a great film on paper, and there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So glad to see that film doing well. Trolls Band Together. Not a Trolls person myself, but $173 million seems like it's doing okay. Wish at $105 million. It broke $100 million worldwide, everybody. It's not going to do it in either domestic or likely international. I know it's got a delayed international release, so that might be what some people are kind of, hoping about. But even if you look at this film, historically about how it's doing in its daily numbers, it's very much like all over the place, right? Usually you see some pretty constant lines for most releases, and this movie is seeing some rises, some dips. It's just not looking good for this movie. I think that it's going to, again, continue on its path to being one of the biggest flops in Disney history, especially when we talk about the actual animated films. Renaissance, $33 million worldwide, not doing much of anything. Napoleon, $170 million. Again, sounds okay for a 2.5 hour, history drama, but costing $200 million. Whew, not even close to what it needs to break even. Waitress, being filmed. Waitress the musical, $3.9 million. Okay. Animal, the new Bollywood film, $14 million there. So I imagine that's probably a pretty good showing for them. And then I did want to give a update on The Shift as well. This film, in its second week of release, dropping 50%, $8.5 million. So right now, we can look at some charting because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews. And so because of that $8.5 million for The Shift, right now I'm projecting it to get somewhere between 12 and 17 million by the end of its run, right? That is the most likely outcome based off of just different historical standards. For those that have never seen my charting before, the way I make it work is that most films tend to make around between 70% or 50% of its entire box office in their first 2 weeks. So films that are not performing nearly as well get closer to the 70% projection. Films that are doing better than expected, meaning that their legs are doing very well, they're doing better in the day-to-day, right? They're holding between weekends very well, tend to get closer to that 50% margin. There's, of course, also those films that will be chart breakers in either direction, right? Some films that do vastly higher, right, than the 50% number there, meaning that it's technically lower as far as the first 2 weeks are concerned, just meaning that the first 2 weeks don't really account for a huge portion of their box office. And there's others where the number is significantly higher, meaning that their number is overall lower, right, over 70% for the first 2 weeks, because ultimately it made it in the first week, maybe the first 2 weeks, and then it just fell out of existence. So based off of that, right, in a worst case scenario, it just, again, historically, obviously it could be a lot worse, and this definitely does happen. 12.1 to 17 million seems to be the case. At a $6.5 million budget, that means this film needs to make around $16 million to break even. Now, of course, that is based off of typical marketing standards, so this number could obviously be a lot lower when you deal with independent studios like Angel Studios, and the way that they finance their films and the way they promote their movies. It's not going to be nearly the same, but these are just the numbers and metrics that we are ultimately going to be using. And with that in mind, it's right now projected to probably get somewhere between 2.4 million in losses or maybe $1 million in gains. Again, does that mean that the film's going to be an actual financial loss? It's still too early to tell. But it is definitely a movie that is not doing nearly as well as a film like Sound of Freedom. And, I'm trying to wonder about After Death. After Death was able to get to $11.4 million. And so right now it is definitely trending to probably surpass that of After Death. But even After Death was at $9 million. Actually interesting. So After Death actually had more money than The Shift in its opening weekend and its 2-week total as well. So interesting that the film will probably end up being higher because it seems to be holding a bit better. But still, The Shift not doing as well as I think that some would hope it to. Napoleon at $170 million means right now it's at close to $200 million in the red. Sorry, I actually skipped a couple things first. So Renaissance, this is a movie, as I mentioned before. We don't have a budget yet, but if it's the same budget or similar budget to that of the Taylor Swift movie, then we're looking at maybe a $6 to $15 million gain. And that's assuming it's 15 million, right? The higher end of the budget that was projected for that Taylor Swift movie was closer to $20 to $25 million budget. So you could actually potentially see this film end up being a financial loss as well, right? Right now, we're looking at it about $2 million in the red. So again, not catastrophic. And I'm sure that they've made that money back in the actual, concert series themselves. And Lord knows Beyonce is not strapped for cash, but it is nice to see a film like this not doing as well as even the Taylor Swift film did earlier just a few weeks ago. Godzilla Minus One at $48 million right now, based on a budget of $15 million, is around $6.5 million in the black, so very good to see those numbers. Can't make any projections on that film or The Boy and the Heron. That's why you have these slash through numbers there, because technically that's what the opening weekend was when you add the domestic and also what it had already made internationally. But again, because that international number goes all the way back to July, in the case of The Boy and the Heron, it's just not going to be, we're not going to be able to have a consistent metric for that or to make any real projections for it. But still, $48 million is very good for a film like it. I would love to see the film to get to well over $100 million. I think that the film very much deserves that. But it is looking like it is a movie that in North American market is being held back by the fact that it is in Japanese. And it's very sad that we have just a lot of film goers who are, kind of hesitant to go to movies where you have to watch a film with subtitles. And again, I understand that to a certain extent. I know there are some people where it's something just kind of beyond them to be able to actually grasp the movie with subtitles because of some visual issue. But at the same time, I wish more people were going to see the movie. Boy and the Heron, as I had mentioned earlier, we don't have the actual budget. $65 million is what I'm projecting based off of what the previous highest grossing, or rather the highest cost movie for one of their movies had been. And so I think that right now 65 million sounds about right. We'll probably find out more as the days go by. But that also would mean right now it's actually sitting in the red. Now, I think the film will probably hold pretty well. I think there's a lot of Miyazaki fans, a lot of anime fans that have seen it and will continue to see it this weekend going into the holiday frame later on as well. So we'll have to wait and see exactly where that movie ends up. But right now it's looking, again, hard to say when it comes to a movie like that, but right now in the red, at least according to the estimates that we have available to us. Wish is absolutely even more so in the red, though. $105 million right now worldwide, putting it at $236 million in the red. So it's actually looking like it might be trending. And again, I think there's a bit of fool's gold here because of the fact that they are having this delayed release internationally. So it's going to continue to make more and more money, similar to how what Elemental had. The difference between this and Elemental was that Elemental started off a lot stronger and did a lot better down the stretch. Wish is not doing that, and so I think that Wish is going to fall out pretty quickly. I would not be surprised if even by next weekend we start to see it drop from like 1,000 screens like we saw with the Marvels, for instance, and for them to kind of give up on Wish just like they gave up on the Marvels as well. But because of that, do expect that their overall percentage to probably maybe even be a chart breaker, right? Even make more than double what they've made, but it'll be because of their delayed release internationally because, as far as why that would have happened. Trolls Band Together at $38 million in the red based off the budget that we have available to us. So looking like this film might end up being a flop, but we still have to wait and see because it is holding pretty well, at least domestically. Thanksgiving was able to make its money, $2.8 million. Again, very impressive there for a film like it. Hunger Games also, as I had mentioned last week, it was able to break even officially. It is now broken even, right? It is now continuing to add to its profits. It's not going to be the most profitable film, right, in the Hunger Games franchise. As I said, it's going to be the lowest grossing of the franchise, and it's also going to be the lowest grossing as far as the net gains are concerned, right? We're talking about a film that might end up I think $50 million in net game profits would be a kind way of saying it. And one could maybe argue it maybe gets closer to $100 million in net game profits when you take into account some of their, financial schemes behind the scenes that made their break-even point a little bit less. But still, really not that, not that strong of an actual release, right? It might make enough, for instance, to pay for its budget, right? To pay back the budget that it had. But when a movie happens like this, especially if you have any plans to make other movies, you want a film that's going to be able to pay for not just that movie, but then the movie that comes after that, and after that, and after that, right? A film like Mario, for instance, made close to $600-700 million in net gain profits. That's paying for 6 more movies, just the production budget alone. Maybe 4 movies when you take into account budgets and marketing. Like, that's the kind of thing you want if you're trying to extend a franchise, for instance. Lord knows Hunger Games was not trying to be a niche film. It was not trying to be one of these artsy films like Killers of the Flower Moon, for instance, or even that of Napoleon, right? It was very much meant to be a mainstream media, a mainstream movie, and it's not making really any type of mainstream money at this point. Again, better than what had been expected by far, absolutely. But still, I mean, even my projections had this film getting somewhere between 281 and 394, and it's looking like this film might end up getting closer to the lower part of that range, maybe getting upwards of 300 million, but still, not going to be performing nearly as well as I think some people had maybe expected it to. The Marvels, again, they say they have abandoned the movie, but remember, the film is still out in theaters, so it is still getting released. They're just not updating their I guess, their weekend numbers at this point in time. If we go back to the numbers.com, let's go ahead and see if they have any update on that film. They do, right? So right now, it's actually reported at $1.3 million. Again, they dropped it from another 500 screens. So even though Disney has said that they've given up on it, and all the articles and headlines were saying that, oh, the movie's done. The movie ends as the worst performing film. That is true, that it's the worst performing film, but it is still in theaters. It is still making money. It's going to make over $200 million worldwide. But that's also still going to lead to a $200+ million loss for the company, in addition to all the other losses that they've had this year. But those are really all the updates as far as films that are currently out and in the news. And so what are y'all's thoughts? Have you seen The Boy and the Heron? As I said, I very much recommend it. Let's go ahead and actually pull up my critic list. If you've not seen my review just last night, I did put this review up on the channel. First off, go check out criticlist.com. It's an amazing site. I love it. It's got a very great community there as well. Don't think of it as another social media site. I know some people are kind of wary of sites like that because they're like, I'm already on Twitter, I'm already on Instagram, I'm already on this or that. It's not like that. It's more of a, hey, if you're a movie fan, this is a great place for you, because not only can you put reviews for your movies with a very awesome color scheme and rating scale, right? The fact that they go from decent to rad to, totally awesome. And then also be able to add other things like having a film be bogus and having a film just be complete and just disgusting, I think is great. But The Boy and the Heron is very, very good. I gave it a rad score. I thought that it was a lot of fun. Not the best Miyazaki film by far, but definitely one that's very, very entertaining. So anyway, with all that being said, check out criticlist.com. For full disclosure, I am not sponsored by them in any way. However, I am a big fan of what they do, and I am in communications with the CEO of the company. Blaine is an awesome dude, and he's got an awesome site. So, hey, check it out. And if you do, follow me over there. Leave a comment on one of my reviews saying that you came here from this video, and I will be very appreciative of that. So anyway, let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like the video, smash that like button. A lot of that fun. I see smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. A blessed second Sunday of the Advent season. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members for the month of November, starting off with Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, the name Eagle Rider. Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. Matt317, check out his Twitch channel. Laura, the Modern Major General Story, sorry, I didn't have enough spirit fingers there. Mr. Roy and ZK-Man, who can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below. You get access to things like the giveaways channel, a podcast that I try to do every single month with a bunch of other awesome YouTubers, and a plethora of other content. So go ahead and check that out if you want more. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.